Thanks so much, Theo, for that lovely introduction. I'll think about it when I'm having bad days. Well, it's truly my honor, actually, to be here and to speak to you all about this work. As Theo mentioned, I'll be talking about my research in Detroit, Michigan to understand reasons for no tree requests submitted by residents, largely in communities of color and lower income communities in Detroit, Michigan, in response to a nonprofit organization's street tree planting program, which you can see on the right, with authority that was granted to the nonprofit from the city government. I started Fair Forest Consulting in 2019 after I published my research in Detroit and ended up, as Theo mentioned, getting picked up by the New York Times, which was quite unexpected, and getting a lot of inquiries from other cities across the country who were facing similar conflicts between all the relevant stakeholders, predominantly the residents who were supposed to be served by these programs, and those who were deploying or implementing these programs, the nonprofits and the city governments. And when I did some digging, I realized that there is very important reasons why this conflict is not unique to the city of Detroit. And so we're going to get into a little bit about why this is a national issue and where we can go from here, learning from what I discovered in Detroit with the communities there. Before I get into that, I want to give a definition of environmental justice, and I think it's important to start with because it gives us a place to aim for. And we are very far right now from environmental justice in many communities across the United States. But by having a definition, it can help us look towards what are we trying to get to. The EPA has a fairly comprehensive and widely used definition. So environmental justice is the fair treatment and meaningful involvement of all people, regardless of race, color, national origin, or income, with respect to the development, implementation, and enforcement of environmental laws, regulations, and policies. Very comprehensive, and we're going to break it down and see how this all comes together to create what we're going to work towards. This is a picture from Warren County, North Carolina in 1982. It's protesters attempting to block delivery of toxic PCB waste to a landfill in the community, and this was in response to the state's decision to locate a hazardous waste landfill in a low-income, predominantly black area. The 1980s was really a big proliferation of the environmental justice movement, mostly because this trend was happening in many communities where hazardous land uses and pollution were being cited mostly near black communities, communities of color, and lower income communities. As you can see, this demonstrates neither fair treatment nor meaningful involvement of those affected. So this is when the first environmental racism, the term, was really coined and used. But what about environmental racism in urban and community forestry? This became more of a topic after the 1980s, predominantly from the 1990s, 2000s onward. Not a lot of people know, and not a lot of effort is given to teaching people about the Great Migration from 1910 to 1970. This is when more than 6 million African Americans migrated from the South to the North, the Midwest, and the Western US to escape racism, the threat of violence, and to seek jobs and educational opportunities in industrial cities, including Detroit. So one of the things that I really want to point out here is that even though racism is very obvious and entrenched in the South, given slavery and the historical legacies of that, the North is not devoid of racism, and unfortunately, there were quite a bit of backlash when this happened. Richard Wright beautifully says in his book, Black Boy, "I was leaving the South to fling myself into the unknown. I was taking a part of the South to transplant into alien soil, to see if it could grow differently, if it could drink of new and cool rains, bend in strange winds, respond to the warmth of other suns, and perhaps to bloom." He was part of this migration from the South to the North, and unfortunately, when he and many others arrived to these new areas, they were met with overtly racist behaviors and policies, including redlining. In the 1930s, the federal government created the Homeowners Loan Corporation, which was basically established to help those who were affected by the Depression to gain access to mortgages so they could buy homes. Risk for mortgage lenders was assessed largely by race and ethnicity. Redlined areas were those that had mostly communities of color, people of color living there. Green-lined areas had mostly white residents. And you can see in the bottom left or bottom right, this is a sign in Detroit, Michigan. We want white tenants in our white community. And a lot of these signs as well, this tract is exclusive and restricted. So what does this have to do with urban forestry and urban greening? A study last year published showed that these racist housing practices from the 1930s have been linked to hotter neighborhoods today. As I said, these low ratings were determined largely by race and ethnicity. So it's not necessarily a surprise that these areas are the areas that have less tree canopy now, and I'll get into that in a second. But basically across 108 cities, the redline neighborhoods are hotter than other neighborhoods in the same city. So we're really getting down to the micro level here, neighborhood to neighborhood. And it just goes to show you how this legacy of intentional segregation now lives on, and without actual intentional action to dismantle it, it continues to live on. This is a map from Oakland, California, where I'm currently doing some work with the city on an urban forest master plan, and you can see the red-lined areas as well as the green-lined areas. Another study published just this year showed that across 37 cities in the US, these red-lined areas that are inhabited by racial and ethnic minorities have an average of 23% tree canopy. Meanwhile, areas inhabited by white populations have an average of 43% tree canopy. Obviously, without tree canopy and without healthy tree canopy, to the extent that we might think is helpful in these communities, there's a lot of debate about what percentage is actually important. It's kind of a little bit besides the point in my opinion, but yes, there is a certain amount of tree canopy that you can see correlations with health outcomes from heat-related illness and asthma and air quality, as well as mental health and social impacts. I think I saw a hand, but we'll definitely get to questions at the end. So the redlining that happened really helped create segregation, but this migration of African Americans to the north and all these other areas in the United States also led white residents in those areas to flee, white flight, to the suburbs, and essentially reinvested their wealth in those areas outside of the city. So you can see in this map here, the dark blue line shows the suburbs of Detroit. And you can see the 1960s is really when white flight to the suburbs peaked. 1967, there was the race riots, but locals in Detroit call it the race rebellion. Not unlike things we're seeing today, there were already racial tensions around policing and residents, and it escalated and came to a peak when a black man was killed by a white police officer. And this really escalated white flight to the suburbs. And you can see at the same time, the city of Detroit, the light blue line down here, the population sharply declines, but the proportion of African Americans went from 9% to over 85%. So this was very much racially motivated. And a study in 2015 talks about how trees grow on money. You need taxes to pay for tree care, especially of public trees. And you also need economic opportunities to pay for tree care of private trees. You can see this street in 1971 in Detroit. By 1984, it looks quite a bit different. Quite a few fewer trees. Part of it is, yes, Dutch elm disease came through, and Detroit was also the epicenter for emerald ash borer in the 1990s. But the resources to actually deal with this and the value and priority placed on dealing with this in communities of color was non-existent, essentially. So this really exacerbated the decline of the tree canopy. Meanwhile, the suburbs, where there had been reinvestment of wealth, had plentiful, healthy tree canopy. This is from that study showing this issue is across the United States, again, because it was a federal policy of redlining, so this happened in every city across the United States. The dark purple areas is a larger proportion of African Americans, and you can see the lighter purple is fewer black residents. And you can see it corresponding to greener areas are whiter areas. Same thing here in Sacramento. If you have more black residents, less trees, more white residents, more trees. So this is just basically, we've already come to understand through many studies across the United States, even when you control for income, race is the largest predictor of tree canopy in a neighborhood. So what does environmental justice mean in the context of urban and community forestry? This is where the discussion needs to move forward, because a lot of what happened was there was lack of federal and governmental support for city services, tree planting, tree care, that really kind of the rug got pulled under from cities around the 1990s, and a lot of nonprofit organizations developed, basically emerged to fill that gap. But a lot of those nonprofits were created and run by residents who were white, outsiders, not from the city. And a lot of it addressed what I call the symptoms of racism, which is a low tree canopy. That is a symptom of racist policies and behavior. It is not the cause. But distributional justice is meaning that we have a fair distribution, equal distribution of trees and their benefits across neighborhoods, regardless of race or income. So what happened was this definition of equal access to healthy and safe trees, parks, and green space. Yes, that is what we're trying to move towards. But the problem was, if you just looked at that, a lot of nonprofits focused on, okay, let's get trees in the ground in those neighborhoods. That's the focus. Not much attention was being placed on how we were going about doing that. Procedural justice is that, so the fair treatment is everyone gets treated fairly. No one's unjustly burdened by pollution or unfairly withheld of environmental benefits. But procedural justice is meaningful inclusion. That's the other part of environmental justice in decision-making about the environment. Super important here because it encapsulates so many issues. First of all, why are we planting trees in the first place? What are our goals? If you look at a lot of community-based plans in Oakland, California, across the United States, in communities of color, the goals are not just to improve environmental health, but to improve economic health and opportunities for residents, to get training and jobs that they would like to work in, to have opportunities to work locally, to have businesses that are both economically helpful but also environmentally healthy. But the focus here was just on planting trees and not necessarily the whole picture. Also, social cohesion, building social relationships. You can design a tree planting program with that being a goal, if that's the goal. If you don't design it that way, and your goal, like many tree planting programs, is let's maximize the amount of stormwater we can capture, let's maximize the amount of carbon dioxide we can sequester, so let's plant all these large shade trees. That fails to consider the fact that those are made based on assumptions. Those are based on assumptions that those trees will survive to actually make those benefits happen, that those trees will be cared for so that they can actually create benefits. And it also disregards that people should have autonomy over their own community and ability to influence how their own community looks and what it's like there. So, and that's going to be a big part in Detroit that I'll talk about. So it's not just about why are we planting trees, but even when we get to the why, what are our tactics to actually achieve that? Where will trees be planted? What species will be planted? Who will take care of these trees, how and when? Because we obviously have seen a really dire situation with tree maintenance not being attended to in a lot of these communities. When you include communities in those decisions, it leads to this distributional justice. That's the outcome. We're not, you know what I'm saying? So we're getting to that outcome, but we have to get to it through procedural justice, which I'll show you in Detroit. Before I get into Detroit real quick though, I wanted to talk about what do we mean by social forestry. So if you look here on the right here, second to the last, many community tree planting programs, this was published in 1994 by my Ph.D. advisor, Maureen McDonough, her Ph.D. student, Carrie Vacta, and some other colleagues. But basically this holds true still in many cases, that they are sharecropping programs, which basically uses community labor to execute a professional urban forester, nonprofit, city government, initiated and driven vision. Okay, and if you think about the legacies of racism in this country, where it's essentially exploitative, trying to exploit communities for free labor to execute whoever is the powerful entity, their vision. I can go into more detail about how this is just an incredibly long legacy in our country. But social forestry is very different because while it can be initiated by a professional or a nonprofit or a city or the community, the key is that there's shared decision making. So I want you to keep that in mind as we go through the example of Detroit, because you're going to see a lot of these sharecropping issues, and you'll see why that was such a problem for people in Detroit, and ultimately a problem for the goal of trying to improve urban forestry and urban tree canopies for those communities and with those communities. So in Detroit, essentially, I just want to show you real quick this population density map. Greener areas are lower population density, red is higher population density. I live in Lansing, which is the capital. Detroit is over here around Lake Erie and the Detroit River. It looks like it has a high population density, and it does relative to the state, but a lot of that is the suburbs around the city itself. So this is a map from the Greening of Detroit, which was the nonprofit I studied. They were established in 1989 by a woman, Elizabeth Gordon Sachs, who moved from Minnesota when her husband became the director of the Detroit Institute of Art. She noticed how depleted the tree canopy was and started the Greening of Detroit. And their mission at the time, these are all the little dots of where they planted trees throughout the city, was to inspire sustainable growth of a healthy urban community through trees, green spaces, healthy living, education, training, and job opportunities. We aspire to provide a greener tomorrow for our Detroit. Well, you see here, inspiring, that's not a controlling word, right? That's not, we're going to decide what to do here. It's inspiring. It's meant to support, right? And also a healthy urban community through trees. Trees are the tool, they are the mechanism, but they shouldn't be the entire focus. It should be the communities that they're serving. But what happens is we write these nice mission statements. Nonprofits can really put a lot of effort into these, but if there's not a check-in process, are we actually doing that? Then you can get far afield from it without even realizing it. Unfortunately, this is what I found in Detroit. So when I was presented with the issue of no tree requests, my Ph.D. advisor served on the board of directors for the Greening of Detroit for many years, and she said, you know, they have all these no tree requests. And my reaction, having grown up in a suburb of Lansing, Michigan, in a predominantly white community where trees were well cared for, I love trees, was, well, who wouldn't want a tree? Trees are great. This is the importance of understanding your positionality, because this is also the positionality that a lot of, and by positionality I mean like, what are your characteristics and how does it affect the way you move through the world? The way you treat people, the way they treat you, the decisions you make, the decisions you can make, where you feel safe, all of these things are affected by our positions. So I was curious and I thought, this is interesting, I don't understand. And what I found out was they hadn't even actually gotten an idea of how many people were submitting no tree requests. So that was the first task, and I found that 25% of residents that were eligible for a free street tree from the Greening of Detroit between 2011 and 2014 had submitted a no tree request for a total of 1,834 trees in that 3-year time period that were not planted. And my goal was to figure out why and what could be done to address this issue. This is actually a picture of a no tree request. It doesn't look very dramatic, does it? One of the mechanisms people used to submit no tree requests was they were told the trees were dropped off on a Saturday morning. They came out, and if they saw it and they didn't realize that the tree was going to be planted, they were told, well, just roll it off the curb and we'll know not to plant it there. Well, you know, that's not a small tree. I can tell you, I've participated in these tree plantings. And that's not a small task. It's also really ad hoc. It's really late in the process and not helpful for conflict resolution. So basically, I'll go into sort of the process for community engagement that was happening. And I know this might sound really harshly critical of the nonprofit, but the point of it is to be critically reflective. And the point of it is not to shame, but hold us all accountable for what we're doing. Because if you're in this position of privilege where you have this kind of power over someone's community, you have to be held accountable. And that's what you've signed up for. So if you're part of that, you're part of a community's fabric, yes, you know, you are going to be expected to be held accountable for things. is it serving people or not? Is it making the problem worse or not? It's not really about you personally even. It's about, are you serving people properly? So I hope that that comes across when I talk about this. The point of this is to learn and to get better. So when I went there, I got a database. Another way they got no tree requests is if they left these door hangers on people's doors 2 weeks before a tree planting. If that community had community groups, sometimes they would send a staff person there to talk about, this is why you should accept the trees that we're offering. These are the benefits it'll offer your community. That was it, okay? There was no discussion. There was no shared decision making, nothing. So basically, I got this database. So people got these door hangers sometimes also 2 weeks before tree planting. You'll see that in a second. And what they also did was it didn't even say you can refuse a tree. It just gave the number. And so people would just call and say, I don't want a tree. So the staff recorded the reasons. So this is about 200 people in fall 2011. Okay, well, what are the reasons people told you on the phone? I just don't want one. General maintenance. I have trees already. Other, whatever that is. Shade, there's all these different reasons. 2012, we're getting even worse here. No reason recorded for 60% of the no tree requests. But the thing is what are the real problems and appropriate solutions? We can't tell this from this quantitative data. We need to have dialogue with people about this. This is from Eleanor and Gerard. It's the conversation continuum. It's a really incredibly important distinction between dialogue and debate, especially in the current era that we live in. So especially I want to point out here, debate is about justifying and defending your assumptions and persuading, selling, or telling people what they should do or what they should be on board with. Dialogue is inquiring into assumptions and learning through inquiry and disclosure. So it's really about holding space for all perspectives, and that was my role, was to talk with the nonprofit, interview them, observe. You'll see some of that in a second. This was what I was doing. You're going to see this in action here. What does that look like to inquire into assumptions? One thing I'll give you a teaser about, the assumption that the nonprofit had, you'll see the quote in a second, was that people didn't realize how beneficial trees were, and that all they had known was negative experiences with trees not being cared for. They didn't realize how important trees are. And so the job of the nonprofit was to convince people, here are all the benefits of trees and this is why you should accept them. They didn't actually ask people, what do you think are the benefits of trees? Do people know about benefits of trees? Is that the reason that they're actually submitting no tree requests? Complete lack of ability and willingness and interest in reflecting inward to our own assumptions and having those blinders on created an incredibly expensive, inequitable, unfair problem. These were the selected study sites in the city of Detroit. This is a vacancy map. Obviously, when you lose a lot of population to the suburbs, you're left with a lot of vacant houses. Dark green areas are more vacancies, but if you see the little fine print here, the light green areas, those little blocks could have between 1 to 50 vacant lots. So just take it with a grain of salt what this map looks like. But basically, I chose areas where the proportion of no tree requests was low, 15% and under, average around 25%, or high, so more than a third of residents. And I wanted to kind of see, are there different dynamics going on? Is there a reason? What I actually found was that no tree requests are a really poor predictor of whether people enjoyed and appreciated the program. Because sometimes it was really stealthy. People were out of town. Tree got planted. They didn't even know they could submit a no tree request. And so actually what I found was that a lot of people were not submitting no tree requests because they didn't know they could or they missed the opportunity. So it really wasn't a good predictor of satisfaction. But I thought, let's check it out. Let's see what's different between these neighborhoods. I collected data with the residents through a variety of means: qualitative research, community engaged research. I asked people, well, what's the best way to talk to people? What's the best way, the most comfortable, culturally appropriate, accessible way to do this? And this is a really important part of community engaged scholarship, is you never do what's convenient for you. You do what's right for the project and the people that you're trying to serve. And you have to make that decision that that's important. So I went to communities, and I lived in Detroit. I experienced the incinerator leaving dust on my car. I experienced what it was like to live in an area with no trees. It was difficult, it was eye-opening, and I attended community meetings and events in all of these neighborhoods, including supplementary sites. And I also did data collection with individuals who attended the meeting, phone conversations if they preferred that, door-to-door interactions with a community leader. Definitely don't go without someone that they trust already and know that can vouch for you. Audio recorded interviews for those who are willing and able, and questionnaires as well for people. This was part of member checking. Member checking is a mechanism for ensuring credibility in qualitative research, where you go back and you ask people, did I accurately represent your lived experience and your reality? Or did I not? Maybe my bias snuck in there and I interpreted something wrong. Practicing reflexivity is also part of that, but you really have to check with people to make sure you interpreted things correctly. I asked residents lots of questions. First, I said, what's special about your neighborhood and what challenges do you face? Those were two separate questions. I know, double-barreled questions. Don't ask it in the same breath. But you ask first, what's special, and then what are the challenges you face? Then I get into, well, what have been your experiences with trees in this neighborhood? Have they been positive? Have you had any tree issues? If so, at how much personal cost? I had one person tell me they had to literally move out of their house because the roots had gotten into their degraded pipes and they couldn't afford to fix it. So they just moved their whole family to a new house. How are you, which by the way is not just a personal cost, but it also just like affects you on many levels, right? Socially and otherwise. How were you involved in the decision to plant a tree? In Detroit, we call it the berm, which is that area between the street and the sidewalk. How were you involved? Again, not making assumptions, but inquiring. What positive impacts, again, do you think, what positive impacts do you think planting trees might have in this neighborhood, and what negative impacts do you think may come from planting trees here? I also went to the Greening of Detroit. It was a lot easier to do audio record interviews because they were on board with the project. They had asked me to do this. They gave me a small stipend to do this research. So I did audio record interviews with staff, board members, volunteers that were all integral to the decision making and the implementation of this program. I also went to tree planting events. You'll see that. I had several office interactions. I went to committee meetings where decisions were made. I went to board meetings. I went to community outreach events to see how they interacted with residents. This all helps enhance the validity of qualitative research and the findings. It's really immersion in the field really helps you get to a much more clear understanding of what's happening. I asked them, well, what are the primary goals of your tree planting program? Is the focus on achieving ecological goals through planting of trees? I just listened, so the blue means I was mainly listening for that, and I sometimes asked probing questions to get to that. What about the social goals and the goals for the process of tree planting? Where was that in all of this? Did that play a role? What were the challenges to achieving your goals? How are residents involved in the decision-making process around tree planting? And I also asked, what are your thoughts and feelings about trees based on what experience? And not surprisingly, a lot of people get into the nonprofit tree planting profession because they love trees. They have grown up with positive, overwhelmingly positive experiences with trees. And again, I did it as well. And so sometimes, unfortunately, this can create blinders to what some other people have experienced, and especially the racial dynamics around that. So key findings. The number of trees planted was prioritized over dialogue. This is one of their tree hangers, their door hangers. It included the date and time of where it was going to happen. It said, here are the benefits of trees. Contact us, again, to help plant your tree. Or to learn how you can partner with us. Volunteers needed, bring work gloves, work boots, and water bottle. Really assuming a lot of resources here that people have and should want to put towards this effort. And then it says you're going to water it, so we will water it every 2 weeks, and then you're going to need to water it additionally throughout the summer. You're going to protect it, all of these things. It does say we have high school students that'll come through, but it doesn't say when or if you can interact with them. And really shockingly, I was stunned when I heard this. We tend to do this during a time of day we know people will not be home because of the amount of time it will take to actively engage in those conversations. All right, so no shame about this whatsoever. And it just goes to show you the focus was so much on, like, he was like, we have a lot to do. Our funders are saying, you said you get 3,000 trees planted. Did you do it? How? Let's see, you know? And if that's your metric of success and that's your primary metric of success, again, you're focusing on trying to address a symptom of racism rather than the causes of that, which is this very oppressive power structure that doesn't allow for anyone else, their needs, their values, priorities to be included in this process. And these are the people you're trying to serve, right? And community engagement focused on persuasion. So this is me with one of the tree planting groups. We did get permission from the homeowner before we planted it. I chose to do that. I was like, I'm not planting this tree unless I talk to somebody first and make sure it's okay. But the board member said, we're just constantly educating people about why what we're doing is important and what they give up by refusing the tree that we're offering. If they don't know what they're missing, they've never had those benefits, all they see is the negatives, which my research found was not the case. In fact, regardless of if you submit a no tree request or accepted a tree, the top 3 benefits that people said were beauty, shade, and oxygen. But they applied those to different species, and they also said it depends on how it's maintained, which is very true. And the legacy of limited city tree care impacted residents' responses. So one woman who submitted a no tree request said, you know, I love trees actually. It makes things beautiful, it makes shade. I love trees, there's no problem with trees. The problem with trees is they have to be maintained, and in our neighborhood, they're not being maintained. Which is true. At the time of this study, there were 20,000 hazardous dead standing trees in the city of Detroit. And the city had the resources to address maybe 3,000 a year. Maybe. You can see this very long tree branch that has fallen here next to this woman. This is a stump that's not been removed. And this is a more recent tree that was planted that doesn't look like it's in great shape and hasn't been maintained. Appears to have been planted in front of a vacant house. And the nonprofit, I asked them about, well, what about maintenance? Because you hear this all the time. What about it? They said, well, I think it's really sexy to plant trees, and it's fundable to plant trees, but it's not sexy to maintain or monitor those trees. So really, it was like, oh, okay, so we're responding to funders putting pressure on you to put as many trees in the ground as possible. This is part of urban political ecology, just to kind of put that in there, which means that we live in a capitalist society. And a lot of the funders are corporations, Merrill Lynch, Quicken Loans. In that framework, the focus is on efficiency, capital accumulation, plant as many trees as possible, and profit maximization. Oh, if you plant this many trees, we'll definitely get all these benefits. We'll get more and more carbon dioxide absorbed, we'll get more and more stormwater absorbed. Tons of assumptions being made there, not necessarily true or measured, for that matter. But you can see just how stark this is happening. So this is a tree that was planted in front of some very unfortunately dilapidated houses. So people have a lot on their plate that they're already dealing with. And one woman said, very appropriately, even though it's the city property, we're going to end up having to care for it, raking leaves, and God knows whatever else we might have to do. And check in on time again. Okay, we're good. For some reason, I feel like I've been talking for like 5 hours. But it's been 30 minutes. So I want to play an audio clip of an interview with a resident because, so just a side story. So my father actually has his Ph.D. in chemistry and was a professor at UMass in chemistry in the 60s. And he got a grant from the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation on his own to go recruit students from historically black colleges and universities in the South to come to the graduate programs up in UMass. And he also set up a mentoring program with the few black faculty that there were. One of the people he recruited was John Rosenthal. John Rosenthal actually secured a grant from the EPA to create the environmental justice program at the NAACP. And he was actually part of the very early involvement of how do we define environmental justice. And I actually got to talk to him on the phone recently. And he told me something I never knew, which was that this definition from the EPA now is missing something. He said, actually, fair treatment, meaningful involvement, there was a third piece. It was knowing involvement. That the information that people need to be engaged and make an informed decision about their community is transparent, it's accessible, and it's provided right? Urban foresters have a lot of really important knowledge, but so do communities about how to make this work. And the really key part and the really important role is for urban foresters and nonprofits to provide that information to communities. Because if you see here in these neighborhoods, high no tree requests, average no tree requests, many people wanted all this information. Who do I contact if something is wrong? Who's going to care for the tree? What's it going to look like? How do I care for it? What do I expect? So they had they had a booklet of the trees they planted with all this great information, but they only gave it to citizen foresters, which were specially trained volunteers that were basically leading all the other volunteers in how to plant the trees properly on planting days. So I took this booklet to my interviews and to residents and said, what do you think about this information? Is this useful to you? What would you like to know? And so I want you to listen to this audio clip from an interview I did with a resident. She got a tree planted when she was out of town, and she's like, what is this tree? I don't even know what kind of tree this is. So I want you to listen to what she says here, because I think it's so much more powerful to just hear her words, and hopefully you all can hear it.
What is your impression of this information, and what would you want to know more about?
I think when they planted the tree, they should have gave me a choice.
Yeah.
Do you want this one, this kind, or this kind? If there's two different kinds of however many, they should have asked me which one I would like.
Mm-hmm.
Versus just saying, okay, you getting this one. And how did they determine who got what tree?
Yeah, that's a good question.
And gave me the information about the trees, what to expect, and you know, because I don't know if any of them that they laid out, something could have been wrong with them. To give me, to say, for instance, if you see this, and this about the tree, contact us so we can, come back out and take a look at it. If something is wrong with the tree, if you see the tree and you notice that it's turning yellow and bugs are all, or something.
Yeah.
Just more information about the tree.
Mm-hmm.
And I really think that, they should have let me choose what kind of, if I wanted the tree, and you have so many that I could choose from, let me choose the tree.
So then I went on to ask her, well, what's the best way to involve you in that decision? So Dr. Monica Cox is a really amazing diversity, equity, inclusion scholar. And she's like, if you're a white person in this realm, working in this realm, you don't have to have all the answers about how to help people. In fact, you probably won't because you've never been in their shoes. So you need to ask, what's the best way to involve you? It's about serving. Again, it's serving people. And you have to ask, not assume, or not do what's convenient for you, or not do what makes you comfortable, but be willing and brave enough to ask and do things differently. And ask funders to support that because it's obviously a need. And you really have to put it to funders. I've done a nationwide training recently with Alliance for Community Trees members, which are all these nonprofit groups throughout the country planting trees in cities. And a lot of what comes up is, how do we talk to funders about this? They don't want to fund this. They want to fund the tree planting. They don't want to fund community engagement. I said, well, you have to tell them that it's their choice. The result, if they just want to plant trees and they don't want to involve the community, this could lead to distrust, could lead to negative outcomes for the trees and the community. If they want to do that, they now have to make that choice because they know that's a choice they're making. The other option is to fund the community engagement and to actually have the opportunity to build trust and credibility with the community and to actually serve people and have the opportunity to make this more equitable and sustainable. The choice is theirs. So now it's a choice they have to make. So I really just think it's important to put that out there. But you see that this is, when John Rosenthal said knowing involvement, this is what he meant. He didn't say, give people the information and tell them what you're going to do for them. It's give people the information so we can make these decisions together based on all the information. This is a really great diagram. It's based, some of you may recognize that it's inspired by Shel Silverstein's The Giving Tree, but it's a visualization from Tony Ruth and Avinash Kaushik. And essentially in the top left, you see inequality, which is unequal access to opportunities. So this is what we see now. Whiter neighborhoods, you get the trees, you get the benefits of the trees. Communities of color, lower income communities, not so much, right? So people are like, oh, so equality means we evenly distribute resources to all communities. Well, the need is greater over here because we've had generations of neglect and oppression. And so we have more need here. Equity means you're creating custom tools that identify and address the sources of the inequality, which means in this case, financial support for tree planting, technical guidance and support. This is what the woman was saying just now. Equipment sometimes. I'm going to show you that in Holyoke in a second. Physical labor. A lot of the people in this community, first of all, it's extremely narrow-minded to assume that everyone has the physical ability to care for trees. Many people in the communities I went to were retired, had disabilities. All of these things were not physically able to do that, and that was never taken into account. And I know, again, I know this sounds really harshly critical, but it's all meant to be, we need to take this seriously. This is serious, and it really doesn't matter whose feelings I hurt on the power hoarding side of things. It matters that we hold the mirror up and say, we need to do better. And it's, again, it's not about shaming. I mean, Maya Angelou said, you do your best until you know better, and when you know better, you do better. And so this is what this means, is being willing to face these harsh truths. And it doesn't mean they're bad people in the nonprofit or they're, awful racist. It means that we didn't know this per se, and now we know this, and we need to be accountable for it, right? I constantly feel like I have to talk about that because sometimes people are like, man, you're so mean to everybody. I'm like, it's not about that. In fact, I'm like, if I say something wrong or offensive or whatever, if I do something, I want someone to point it out to me. Because that means that I'm doing my job. Because it matters way more to me that I get it right, as Brene Brown says, than that I am right. Or that I'm defending. Like, I want to, do what's right and not just be right. You know what I'm saying? So we all have a lot to learn in this area, but basically the key thing here is that tree planting occurs in a context that's shaped by power and values. When you look at the physical reality of Detroit canopy is at 20%, a healthy city should have more, you just look at that, then yes, the answer is we need to plant more trees. But that's a very minimal context. We need to look at why is the tree canopy that low. It's ecological issues like diseases, but it's also disinvestment, white flight, race-based conflict, power hoarding. This leads to the physical reality, but also a social reality, which is that people have had diverse experiences, good, bad, and ugly, as we found out already, and diverse responses to tree planting. Some people think it's better to plant than not. Some people think it's acceptable in certain conditions, like if the tree's maintained, if we have a maintenance plan, if I had some choice. Some people are like, we need to reform this system before we plant trees. So based on that, it's not just about planting new trees, it's about maintaining new and old trees, finding ways to do that, providing more information and choice. By doing that, we are going to have this broader and deeper context, and a more equitable and sustainable forest is possible. Again, lots of tree planting pictures here with me and residents. I'm just always checking the time. This was actually already in the 1990s. Clark and colleagues said to have a sustainable forest, which technically speaking means that it continues to produce benefits at the same level over time. That's an aspiration, but it's not necessarily something it's something we go towards. It's not necessarily something we can always achieve or even know if we achieve, but we try to get there. But you need not only a healthy vegetative resource, which is the tree, but you need to have a supportive, and I added, supported community and an adequate maintenance regime. Okay, so these are all the ingredients here. And these all need to be taken into account. We really need to be thinking more creatively and equitably about the governance structures that are going to help us get there. So applying these lessons and strategies beyond Detroit, I started consulting in 2019. What I think we're moving towards is not just procedural or distributional justice, but restorative justice. We cannot continue to ignore the legacies of oppression that we've all been born into. Restorative justice is an approach to addressing harm or the risk of harm through engaging all those affected in coming to a common understanding and agreement on how the harm or wrongdoing can be repaired and justice achieved. It's not just about involving people procedurally in the process, it's about acknowledging the harm that's been done and coming to an agreement together about how to repair that harm. How do we repair these relationships? This is from the European Forum on Restorative Justice from just last year. The foundations for restorative justice is having respect for all involved, accountability, healing, and empathy. Empathy is something that can be taught. Some people are naturally empathetic. I'm someone who was born naturally empathetic. But you can learn this skill, and it doesn't mean you've been through the same thing someone's been through, but it does mean you can relate to the feeling that they're feeling. Have you ever felt excluded, isolated, disregarded, devalued, frustrated, disempowered, all these things? If you've ever felt that, you can relate to someone on that level. You can empathize. I want to provide an example. This is from Holyoke, Massachusetts. Actually, Theo is an author on this publication. This was in reference to a state-led program. The Department of Conservation and Recreation at the state level in Massachusetts led this program in Holyoke. And basically what happened here was you have the solid lines is a successful stewardship relationship, which means the trees were more likely to survive. Theo, please feel free to correct me if I'm wrong on anything. The dotted lines are unsuccessful stewardship relationships where the trees were less likely to survive. And you can see an unsuccessful stewardship relationship with the local program recipients, which is public housing, public schools, businesses, and nonprofits. So why was this an unsuccessful stewardship relationship? Well, because they relied on program recipients to purchase their own slow-release watering bags and to seek help themselves if their local stewardship did not fare well. That's putting a lot of onus on people who already have distrust. They may not be willing to reach out to government or et cetera. They may not know how or who to contact. And the purchasing slow-release watering bags, the trees that were stewarded by the state benefited from that, which drastically reduces time needed for watering. Again, we're talking about equity. How much time are we asking people to do this? If they can't purchase it, then they're going to have to pay for it with their time. The trees that were stewarded by the state foresters were 5 times more likely to survive. The problem here is that now those neighborhoods have dead trees. So it's actually a worse problem because before you didn't have trees and now you have some dead trees that you have to figure out removing and figuring out what do we plant here or can we plant here. I mean, there's that added cost. So it really, even though it's not sexy to fund maintenance, I mean, it's certainly any business person can understand the cost, right? About if we don't invest in this cost now, it can be a cost later. So I actually just recently worked with the city of Holyoke on I believe the first ever nationwide urban forest equity plan. Not easy during COVID to figure out community engagement. We worked with community leaders. We designed community engagement strategies. We had a multitude, bilingual, different activities, a web page, media outreach. We asked them what's the best way to reach people, postcards, virtual community forums. We were told Facebook Live was much more user-friendly and used in the communities than Zoom. We had online surveys. We had printed copies of the surveys in English and Spanish. We had community leaders going out and giving information about the meetings as well as the surveys at like local food distributions, places people were already going to be. And we also, so this virtual forum, we did a lot of active listening, which is about asking open-ended questions. So What have been the community's experiences with trees? How does this affect their views on urban forestry? You can see a lot of the lessons from Detroit being applied here. How would residents like to be involved in urban forestry, and what would help to make urban forestry efforts more accessible, inclusive, and empowering? And you really have to also be attuned to feelings and ask probing questions to make sure you understand what's going on. We also did a selfie contest. And we advertised this in a variety of mechanisms through community groups and other like local grocery stores and et cetera. We offered, I think, a $50 gift card to the local grocery store for the winner of the selfie contest. What this was meant to do, we asked, basically, this was a suggestion of a local community group, like, why don't you do a selfie contest? And I was like, oh, that's a good idea. And it's basically to try to make the plan more about the community and less about what outsiders think should be the values of trees, et cetera. So this is one person who submitted a selfie. This is Fernando. Holyoke's actually a place where a lot of people from Puerto Rico that were affected by Hurricane Maria moved to. There's already a pretty established Hispanic population. And he said, this is my favorite tree because it was the first place I visited in Holyoke after Hurricane Maria in 2017. This is the first tree that I saw with this beautiful color, the first time that I saw it in real life. So it's really just like, again, centering communities in this process and what is their experience, what is their lived experience. Consistent two-way communication is really critical. And now I have misplaced my phone. Ah, here it is. We're getting to the end, I promise. These are lessons. So this is from Penn State University's Engagement Toolbox. The more that residents and communities understand the process that decisions are made by, whatever your goals and intended outcomes are in the urban forestry organization, this is key, the information they need to make an informed choice, the perspectives of each other, and their roles and stake in the process and issue, the more trust your engagement efforts will engender and be able to build from in the long run. I'm also an equity consultant in Oakland, California. They're doing their first ever urban forest master plan. It's a really ambitious one, 50-year vision. And so I'm helping to guide them in that process of including community voices. But one of the things they've already done in the development of their healthy development guidelines is they ensured that the leadership prioritized residents' voices by having community-based organizations hold the majority of seats on the team. This is equity. Not equal seats, majority seats, because we have traditionally, again, had neglect, oppression, disregarding of those voices. Also, to help with this last one, what is everyone's role and stake? The leadership team created an organization chart to clarify roles and streamline the development of the guidelines. These are some lessons that we're trying to now take and apply to the urban forest master planning process. It's not just about identifying what have you done badly, what have you done wrong that you need to do differently. It's also about what have you done well? What can we build from? What lessons can we take from that and apply to this? We don't need to reinvent the wheel all the time. This is actually the first woman that agreed to do an interview with me in Detroit, and she ended up introducing me to other neighbors to do interviews with. She holds a special place in my heart. She's a wonderful woman. But what promotes trust is also a long-term situation, the opportunity to learn about each other's reputations, and the possibility of communication between all relevant parties. So when you eliminate all those things from the process, you're going to go down the road of distrust. And you can think about this. Who do you trust? And why? It's probably somebody that you've known for a while. You've had an opportunity to understand if they're reliable, if they have good intentions, if they follow through on their actions, etc. And you've probably had a decent amount of communication. This is the foundation. We're all in relationships. We all know these things inherently. It's time that we apply this to urban and community forestry a lot more. Logistics, it's about, these are things like free childcare. This is something they did for the development of their equitable climate action plan. They had free meals, they had interpretation, methods, ensuring that the community is actually designing the methods of engagement that are culturally appropriate. Like, what are the kinds of ways? Do they want to be on an advisory committee? Do they not? Whatever. Those are all the different things to think about. It's not just logistics, but also methods. And you need a mechanism for sustained engagement and accountability. And a lot of times people are like, well, how do we do that? Well, you can have regular standing community meetings, which actually have this large co-benefit of strengthening community cohesion and capacity and resilience. You could also, really important to have decentralized neighborhood-based governance bodies, so like local issue-based implementation committees to gain mutual accountability, and you want to have meaningful compensation because you're asking people for their time and expertise. So I did mention I did this interactive web-based training for environmental justice groups, or for environmental justice for urban forestry groups. One of the things I'm really trying to help them with is developing metrics of success that are holistic. I promise we're getting to the end. But beyond this number of trees planted, we need to be thinking a lot more about how many trees are we planting that are actually fulfilling the values that are important to people? How many trees are we planting in locations that are desired or agreed upon? How many people are actually seeking to become involved because they heard their neighbor had a good experience, because the process is more inclusive? Again, we normally look at tree survivability and health, but what actually leads to tree survivability and health? Well, do you have a collaborative stewardship plan that's been agreed upon? How many residents and foresters are actually involved in monitoring and stewardship? How responsive are you to residents' tree issues? And again, how many more people want to be involved because it's an inclusive, accessible process? We need to move beyond just number of volunteers engaged on planting days. I can tell you the majority of people in Detroit that were planting trees on Saturday morning worked for Quicken Loans and lived in the suburbs. They were not neighborhood residents. They were not even there to have conversation with residents. They were just there, plant the trees, and then leave. Not helpful in healing the whole white flight situation. So we need to look at how many community residents are engaged before, during, and after tree planting days as well. Also tending to look at what are the power people's satisfaction. Are the funders happy? Is the nonprofit happy? Is the board happy? Well, what about the community residents? Are they happy with the process and the outcomes? Because that's who we're serving. And how much social cohesion are we developing either between residents or even between the residents and the nonprofit because of this process being more inclusive? So this is what I'm asking people in these trainings is how are you measuring environmental justice? How are you measuring meaningful involvement of residents in decision making and their satisfaction with process and outcomes of your program? A lot of them aren't measuring this. Spoiler alert. And it's hard to measure also. This is why I'm trying to help people with learning how to do qualitative research and data collection. I also asked them, how could you integrate these measurements into your programs? How are you working with community-based leaders to develop culturally appropriate modes and times to collect this data? These are all questions you can ask and get answers to. So future research is the last thing I'll mention. I think there's a lot we can be doing with this to move forward. I think first and foremost, applying these community engagement recommendations and assessing their effectiveness is utmost importance, especially in historically disenfranchised communities. Some possible research questions are, how does increased involvement in decision-making about tree planting impact residents' trust of city government and urban forestry organizations? Trust and engagement. Which tools and practices are most helpful in facilitating meaningful and equitable engagement of historically disenfranchised communities? And how do equitable engagement approaches impact tree health and the benefits to communities over time? And the last thing I'll say here is there's now all these lovely technological tools. They're very fancy, lovely things that are very helpful, like the Tree Equity Score, which was from American Forests, pilot program in Rhode Island. Awesome tool. You can dive deep with data. You can build, save, and share custom tree planting scenarios. Well, how can these new tools help support grassroots engagement in urban and community forestry? So the Tree Equity Score, iTree is another suite of tools. StewMap, stewardship mapping, is another one. So these are things that I think we need to be democratizing and making more transparent and accessible and inviting to people and figuring out how helpful are they in that process. So thank you to all the community groups and et cetera who were involved in this research. Here's my contact info. I think I went to an hour, just about an hour. And I welcome your questions at this time.
Thank you.